In this tutorial, we're going to look at a brief introduction to hooks and a small look at why they exist. Hooks were introduced in React 16.8 and React Native 0.59, and they were first publicly announced at ReactConf in 2018. Essentially, they allow you to use state and other React features without the need of writing classes, and we'll look at what that means as we proceed with our tutorials. Now, some things to note before we get into it. The first one is that hooks are completely opt-in. You can use hooks on new components in a project without rewriting any of your existing code, and they will not force you to make any changes. Secondly is that hooks are 100% backwards compatible and there are no breaking changes. So if you have code that is already written using classes and you want to start trying out hooks, you don't have to worry about those two types of code being able to interact together or live within the same project, within the same code base. They'll be able to live together well without any problems at all. And number three is that there are no plans from the React team to remove classes. So if ever you love classes and you think classes are great, you have no reason to move over to hooks, then the React team is not forcing you to move to hooks, and classes are always going to be there. They're always going to be supported from what the React team says. And finally, hooks don't replace your knowledge of React concepts. Instead, they provide a more direct API to the concepts that you already know. So the state, lifecycle methods, the React lifecycle, the virtual DOM, all of those things still remain the same. And hooks just give you a better way of using React. Now, what is the motivation behind hooks? There are basically three reasons that the React team gives as the motivation behind hooks, and we'll look at them in this section. The first one is that it's hard to reuse stateful logic between components. There's already patterns like render props and higher order components that do this, but these require you to restructure your components when you use them, which can be cumbersome and make code harder to follow, and they're harder to read in my opinion. They also cause wrapper hell because every time you use a render prop or a higher order component, you're essentially wrapping your component in another component. And so you end up with this React tree that is deeply nested with multiple components, which makes it a little harder to read and parse as you debug and think about your application. The second reason is that complex components become harder to understand when using classes. When using classes on complex components, each lifecycle method often contains a mix of unrelated logic. For example, a component might perform some data fetching in component did mount and component did update. However, the same component did mount method might also contain some unrelated logic that sets up event listeners, with cleanup of those listeners done in component will unmount. So you end up with this scenario as shown in the picture where related code has to be split across multiple methods within your class. And with the case of, say, component did mount and component did update, you end up needing to mirror or repeat all of the code that you put in component did mount and component did update for you to get the proper functionality that you're looking for. Additionally, mutually related code gets split apart, but completely unrelated code ends up combined in a single method, making it easy to introduce bugs and inconsistencies. This is one of the reasons many people prefer to combine React with a separate state management library like Redux. However, that often introduces too much abstraction, requires you to jump around between files, and makes using components more difficult. The third reason is that classes can be a pain, and they can end up confusing both people and machines. Classes increase the React learning curve in that you have to understand how the this keyword works in JavaScript, which is often different from how it works in other programming languages. And you have to remember to bind event handlers or to use arrow functions which have a lexically scoped this, But then that becomes an additional layer of complexity to somebody who is trying to get into React and somebody who's trying to learn programming in general. This would not be a problem otherwise, but if there is a simpler way to deal with it, then it's great to use that simpler method instead. Even experienced React developers argue about class and functional components and when to use each one. Should we use this as just a purely view component and take out state out of it? Or should we put state here and there? And that becomes a problem. The React team also cites other performance-related reasons with using classes that I won't get into in this tutorial, but feel free to read about them in the React documentation. So those pain points again. The first one is that there's no simple way for reusing stateful logic. The second one, complex components easily get long and hard to read. And the third one, classes can be a pain. And if you think about it, these are not three separate problems, but three symptoms to one problem, which is React doesn't provide a stateful primitive simpler than class components to handle stateful logic. And so if we can find a better way or a different way to introduce stateful logic and hook into lifecycle events within a component without using classes, then we would solve most of these things. So enter hooks. Hooks solve these problems in three ways. The first one is that hooks allow you to reuse stateful logic without changing your component hierarchy, which makes it reusable and independently testable. Because at the end of the day, React hooks are just functions. And so if you're able to yank that function out of the component, you're then able to test it independently and to just move it around and reuse it in different modules. Secondly, hooks let you split one component into smaller functions based on what pieces are related, such as setting up a subscription or fetching data, rather than forcing a split based on lifecycle methods. You may also opt into managing local state with a reducer, which makes it more predictable in cases where your state is a little bit complex. Hooks conveniently provide a use reducer hook for this. And number three is that hooks let you use more of React's features without classes. Hooks enable using all of React's features actually within function components, eliminating the need for classes. Now you can still use classes if you want to, but you now have the ability of using all of the features that you previously could only use in classes within function components. And that's great. So this was a brief introduction to React hooks. In the coming tutorials, we're going to explore each of these concepts and learn about them a little further as we explore each of the hooks. I hope this was useful to you.